They invited him to laugh. They expected embarrassment. They saw a blind black boy and assumed silence would follow. But the moment his fingers touched the piano, the room changed forever, because talent doesn't ask for permission and truth doesn't need sight. The chandelier above the Lincoln Arts Center didn't flicker, but something else did. It was subtle, almost invisible, a shift in attention. The kind that happens when a room full of powerful people suddenly notices someone who doesn't belong. The charity gala had been flawless until that moment. Every detail had been rehearsed. The velvet seats, the polished Steinway grand resting under stage lights like a throne, the low hum of expensive conversations about endowments, European tours, and last summer's festivals in Salzburg. This was not a place for surprises, and certainly not a place for mistakes. Vincent Sterling stood near the piano, perfectly framed by the light. 42 years old, internationally celebrated. His name alone could sell out concert halls across 3 continents. Critics describe his playing as precise, disciplined, and immaculate. No one ever used the word kind. He adjusted his cufflinks casually, scanning the audience with the comfort of someone who knew the room belonged to him. These people weren't just listeners. They were donors, critics, decision-makers, people who decided who mattered in music and who didn't. Then he noticed a boy, 16, standing near the piano, holding a white cane. The conversations around him softened into murmurs. Vincent's eyes lingered for just a second too long. Not curiosity, not concern, amusement. The boy hadn't wandered in by accident. He stood beside a woman in a modest black dress, clearly not part of the usual crowd. Her posture was careful, almost apologetic, as if she were constantly aware she was borrowing space she didn't own. This was Ms. Elaine Carter, a public school music teacher from the south side of the city. She had won 2 tickets through a diversity outreach raffle, something the foundation advertised proudly, but rarely talked about afterward. The boy beside her was her student, David. He didn't move, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. David stood still, listening. The room spoke in ways most people never noticed. Heels against marble, fabric brushing skin. Breath held just a fraction longer when eyes turned toward him. David knew that sound. It was the sound of being evaluated. Vincent smiled. Not the warm kind, the performative kind. Well, he said, his voice carrying effortlessly through the hall. It seems we have a special guest tonight. A few polite laughs followed. Not everyone laughed. Enough did. Vincent gestured toward the piano with theatrical generosity. Young man, he continued, how about you come up here and play something for us? Ms. Carter stiffened. David didn't respond immediately. Just for fun, Vincent added, tilting his head slightly. I'm sure you know something simple. Happy birthday, perhaps? This time, the laughter wasn't muffled. It rolled. David felt Ms. Carter's hand tighten around his sleeve. He knew this moment. He had lived versions of it before. Classrooms where voices lowered when he entered. Competitions where judges spoke slowly, as if blindness dulled understanding. Compliments that sounded suspiciously like pity. But this was different. This was public. Vincent's tone suggested generosity, but his eyes told a different story. They sparkled with the quiet confidence of someone who knew the joke would land exactly where he wanted it to. David took a slow breath. No one in the room knew what that breath contained. They didn't know it carried 8 years of silence after a car crash. They didn't know it carried nights spent counting keys instead of sheep. They didn't know it carried a memory so sharp it never faded. The last sound his mother laughing before everything went dark. Vincent leaned closer to the microphone. Don't be shy, he said. Our patrons love moments like this. Ms. Carter opened her mouth to speak. She never got the chance. David lifted his head slightly. Actually, he said calmly, his voice clear and unshaken, I prefer Bach. The room froze. Not completely. Just enough. Vincent blinked. Bach? He repeated, letting the words stretch thin. Really? David nodded once. What piece? Vincent asked, smiling wider now. This wasn't part of the script, but it was better. David paused, not because he was unsure, because timing matters. Partita number 2 in C minor, he said. Then, almost as an afterthought, but it might be a little advanced for this audience. Silence felt like something dropped. Heavy, final. Some people shifted. Others frowned. A few leaned forward, suddenly alert. Vincent felt something tighten behind his smile. Had this boy just... A ripple of discomfort spread through the room. Vincent chuckled sharply. "Well," he said, "confidence is admirable." He turned slightly toward the audience, as if sharing a private joke. "You see," he continued, "this is why inclusion is so important. Everyone deserves to try." Miss Carter's face burned. David heard the shift. The tone had changed. This was no longer playful. It was condescending. Vincent stepped closer to the piano and placed one hand on its polished surface. "This piece," he said, "requires emotional maturity, technique, years of training." He glanced back at David. "Are you sure you want to embarrass yourself?" David tightened his grip on the cane for just a moment, then relaxed it. "No," he said quietly. "I'm sure." Something about the way he said it unsettled Dr. Harrison Webb, seated in the third row, a conductor with 4 decades of experience. Webb had seen prodigies rise and collapse under pressure, but this didn't feel like bravado. It felt prepared. Vincent exhaled through his nose. "Very well," he said. "Let's hear it." But before David could move, Vincent sat down at the piano himself. He cracked his knuckles unnecessarily. "Let me remind you," he said, "how it's meant to sound." His fingers touched the keys. The first bars filled the room, precise, controlled, flawless, and cold. David listened, not passively. He listened the way some people read blueprints. Every pause, every emphasis, every decision. Vincent finished with a flourish and stood, basking briefly in polite applause. "There," he said. "Now you..." David stepped forward. Slowly, carefully, he placed his cane against the bench with practiced ease. Before sitting down, he turned slightly toward the audience. "May I ask one question?" he said. Vincent rolled his eyes. Briefly, David nodded. "Has anyone here ever lost everything they loved in a single moment and had to rebuild themselves one note at a time?" The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't awkward. It was aware. Vincent felt something stir in his chest. Unease. David turned back to the piano. And that was the exact moment, when the evening stopped being entertainment and became reckoning. No one in that room knew where David came from. They saw a blind boy in borrowed clothes standing beside a piano that cost more than his entire neighborhood. They saw a charity experiment, a diversity checkbox, a brief interruption before the real program resumed. What they didn't see was a life that had shaped him long before he ever stepped into that hall. David Thompson was 8 years old the first time the world went silent. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, ordinary in every way that matters until it isn't. He had been sitting in the back seat of his mother's car, humming along to the radio, his fingers tapping imaginary keys against his knee. His father was laughing about something unimportant, the kind of moment people never remember because they assume there will always be another one. There wasn't. The impact came without warning. Metal screamed, glass shattered, and then darkness. When David woke up in the hospital, he couldn't see the ceiling lights everyone kept describing to him. He couldn't see his Aunt Deborah crying quietly in the corner. He couldn't see the way doctors avoided his questions. He could only hear one sentence repeating in different voices. "Your parents didn't make it." The blindness came later, not immediately, just slowly enough to feel cruel. Shapes faded, colors dissolved, faces disappeared one by one, until the last thing he ever saw was his mother's smile, reconstructed entirely from memory. At 8 years old, David learned that grief doesn't announce itself. It waits. After the funeral, he moved into a small apartment with Aunt Deborah on the outskirts of the city. She worked 2 jobs, cleaning offices by night and the city conservatory by day. She was exhausted most of the time, but she never let David hear it in her voice. What she didn't know how to help him with was the silence. David stopped speaking much, not because he had nothing to say, but because words felt insufficient. Teachers called him withdrawn. Counselors used phrases like adjustment period and trauma response. None of them noticed what David noticed. That silence had texture. It had rhythm. At night, when the city settled, David would sit on the edge of his bed and listen. Pipes clicking, distant sirens, the soft hum of electricity in the walls. Slowly, unconsciously, he began organizing those sounds in his mind. Patterns. One evening, while Aunt Deborah was making dinner, he reached the old upright piano in the church basement where she cleaned on weekends. The keys were chipped. Half of them were out of tune. David pressed one, then another. He froze. Something inside him shifted. For the first time since the accident, the noise in his chest softened. The notes didn't ask him to explain his pain. They didn't rush him. They didn't look away when things got uncomfortable. They stayed. Deborah found him hours later, fingers still hovering over the keys. He didn't tell her what he felt. He didn't have to. From that day on, music became the language David rebuilt himself with. Not as a hobby, not as therapy, as survival. Because David couldn't read sheet music the way other students did. He listened, obsessively. Recordings played until the tapes wore thin. When Deborah gained access to the conservatory's archives, she smuggled home discarded recordings and outdated Braille scores. David memorized everything, not just notes, but intention. He learned the difference between how Bach sounded when he was grieving and how Mozart played with joy that bordered on defiance. He learned how performers revealed themselves not in what they played, but in what they avoided. By the time he was 12, David could reproduce entire symphonies after hearing them once. By 14, he was correcting teachers, gently. By 16, he had learned something even more important. Talent doesn't protect you. It paints a target. At school, classmates alternated between fascination and cruelty. Some treated him like a miracle. Others treated him like a burden. Teachers praised his spirit more than his skill, a compliment that always landed wrong. David noticed. He noticed how expectations lowered when people felt uncomfortable. He noticed how praise softened when it came wrapped in pity. He noticed how often brilliance was dismissed because it arrived in an unexpected body. So he learned to be quiet, not because he was unsure, but because timing matters. That night at the Lincoln Art Center, as he sat at the piano bench, David wasn't nervous. He was remembering. He remembered practicing 8 hours a day on a borrowed keyboard in a damp basement, hands aching, skin raw. He remembered being told certain schools weren't equipped for students like him. He remembered auditions where the applause came too quickly, like people were relieved it was over. And he remembered making a decision. If he was ever given a real stage, he wouldn't ask for approval. He would speak the truth. Vincent Sterling didn't know any of this as he stood nearby, arms crossed, confidence cracking just slightly at the edges. He didn't know that David had studied his recordings, that he knew his tendencies, his strengths, his emotional blind spots. David had listened to Vincent play Bach dozens of times. He knew exactly what was missing. As the audience waited, caught between anticipation and discomfort, David placed his hands gently on the keys. He didn't rush, because for him, this wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about honoring the boy who survived the darkness long enough to reach this moment. And the first note he was about to play wasn't just music. It was memory. The room didn't know it yet, but it had crossed a line. Up until now, everything could still be framed as a misunderstanding, an awkward moment, a famous pianist indulging a charity gesture that had gone slightly off script. That was the story most people in the audience were telling themselves, because it was the most comfortable one. Comfort, after all, was the currency of rooms like this. Vincent Sterling felt the shift before he understood it. The energy had changed, not dramatically, not loudly, but in the way seasoned performers recognized instantly. The audience was no longer on autopilot. They were watching. That irritated him. He had spent his entire career controlling rooms like this, controlling silence, controlling admiration, controlling when people leaned forward and when they relaxed back into their seats. This wasn't supposed to be a moment. This was supposed to be a joke. Vincent cleared his throat and smiled again, but the smile came slower this time, as if it had to be retrieved rather than worn. "Well," he said lightly, glancing at his watch, "this has been entertaining, A few people laughed uncertainly. However, he continued, we do have a program tonight, a serious one. He emphasized the word serious. David remained seated, hands resting quietly on the edge of the piano bench. He hadn't played a single note yet, but something about his stillness unsettled Vincent more than any wrong key ever could. Vincent turned toward the audience. These charity initiatives are important, he said, projecting reasonableness. Exposure matters. Inspiration matters. But let's not confuse encouragement with expertise. That landed. Several heads nodded. Margaret Rothschild, seated in the front row, leaned toward the woman beside her. She didn't whisper. There are standards, she said flatly. If we abandon them, what separates excellence from enthusiasm? A ripple of agreement moved through the crowd. David heard every word. He always did. Vincent seized the moment. Young man, he said, addressing David directly now, his voice sharpening just enough to draw blood without leaving a mark. You seem very confident for someone who hasn't yet played a note. David tilted his head slightly. I've been listening, he said. Vincent laughed, a short, dismissive sound. Listening, he repeated. That's admirable, but listening and performing are very different things. He stepped closer to the piano, invading David's space just enough to establish dominance. This piece you mentioned, Bach Partita No. 2, is one of the most demanding works in the repertoire. It's not something you try. He leaned in. It's something you earn. The audience murmured again. This time, the sound carried approval. Vincent straightened and addressed the room. Perhaps, he said, we should allow our young guest to demonstrate what he means. Briefly. The word briefly was not accidental. David felt the weight of the moment settle fully now. This wasn't encouragement. This was spectacle. He stood slowly, every movement deliberate. When he turned to face the audience, his expression was calm, but not submissive. I don't need much time, he said. Vincent smirked. That's good, he replied. Neither do we. A few guests laughed again, more confidently now. The discomfort was fading. People knew which side of the story they were supposed to be on. Miss Carter shifted in her seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had seen this before, the moment when a room decides someone's value without ever listening. David reached for the bench again. Before sitting, he spoke. Before I play, he said, I'd like to clarify something. Vincent exhaled sharply. Oh, please, he muttered. This is a concert hall, not a lecture. David didn't react. When people talk about music, he continued, they often confuse difficulty with depth. That caught attention. Speed with mastery. David said, precision with truth. Vincent felt heat rise in his chest. You're treading dangerously close to arrogance, he snapped. David turned his face slightly in Vincent's direction. No, he said, I'm explaining why arrogance is so easy to hear. The room went quiet, not polite quiet, alert quiet. Vincent laughed again, but this time it sounded brittle. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, throwing his hands up theatrically, apparently we're being lectured on musical philosophy by someone who's never set foot in a conservatory. That did it. The laughter that followed was louder, freer. The audience had been given permission. David felt it wash over him, not as shame, but as clarity. This was the moment. Vincent walked back to the piano and sat down abruptly. Let's simplify things, he said. I'll play the opening again. Then you can respond. He didn't wait for agreement. His fingers struck the keys. Technically flawless. Clean, impressive, and empty. As Vincent played, he watched David from the corner of his eye, expecting nervousness, hesitation, something. He saw none. David stood perfectly still, head slightly tilted, as if absorbing something far more than sound. Vincent finished and looked up, satisfied. There, he said. Now everyone knows what excellence sounds like. David spoke softly. You modulated the tempo in the allemande, he said. Vincent frowned. What? You slowed the second phrase. David continued calmly. Not enough for most people to notice, but enough to avoid the emotional transition Bach intended. The room stiffened. Vincent laughed, but his voice cracked just slightly. That was interpretive choice, he said quickly. David nodded. "Of course," he replied. "It usually is." A few guests exchanged glances. Dr. Harrison Webb leaned forward in his seat, interest sharpening. Vincent stood abruptly. "You know," he said sharply, "this is exactly what happens when we confuse access with authority." He turned toward the audience again. "We invite people in without preparing them for the realities of excellence, and then we're surprised when they overestimate themselves." David felt something settle in his chest. Not anger, resolve. He placed one hand gently on the piano. "I don't overestimate myself," he said quietly. "I underestimate how little people listen." Vincent stared at him. The room held its breath. "Enough," Vincent snapped. "Play, or leave." David nodded once. "Very well," he said. He adjusted the bench, sat down, placed his hands above the keys. And for the first time that evening, Vincent Sterling felt something unfamiliar crawl up his spine. Fear, because in that silence, that absolute, focused silence, David wasn't a charity case anymore. He was a presence. And whatever was about to happen next would not be controlled. Not by reputation, not by money, not by power, only by truth. Silence settled over the hall like a held breath, not the awkward silence of earlier, not the polite waiting silence people use between performances. This was different. This was the kind of silence that listens back. David sat at the piano, without moving. His hands hovered above the keys, not searching, not trembling, just waiting, the way a speaker waits for a room to become still enough to hear something important. Vincent Sterling remained standing a few steps behind him, arms crossed, jaw tight. He told himself the unease in his chest was irritation, that it was impatience, that it meant nothing. But his body knew better. In the third row, Dr. Harrison Webb leaned forward unconsciously. He had spent 40 years studying musicians at the exact moment before they played. The inhale before sound, the posture that revealed whether a performer was about to survive or collapse. David did neither. He settled. Ms. Carter clasped her hands together. She recognized that posture. She had seen it in David during exams, before difficult conversations, before moments that mattered more than he ever admitted. The room waited. David lowered his hands. The first note emerged softly, not announced, not pushed. It didn't ask for permission. It simply existed. Something shifted instantly, not in volume, not in tempo, in weight. The sound carried a depth that made people unconsciously sit straighter. The note wasn't louder than Vincent's playing had been, but it felt closer, as if it bypassed the ears and settled somewhere behind the ribs. David continued. The opening phrase unfolded slowly, deliberately, each note placed with intention rather than urgency. There was no rush to impress, no attempt to display difficulty. The music breathed. Vincent's brow furrowed. This wasn't how he played it. This wasn't how anyone played it. David allowed space between phrases, just enough to let the silence speak. That silence carried something Vincent's performance hadn't. Memory. The audience didn't know why their throats tightened. They didn't know why a few people shifted uncomfortably or why someone in the back exhaled shakily. They only knew something was happening. David's fingers moved with precision, but not stiffness. There was no visible strain. The difficult passages flowed without effort, as if the music wasn't being executed, but remembered. Vincent felt his confidence fracture, just slightly. This wasn't amateur luck. This wasn't enthusiasm. This was control, but not the kind he understood. As David reached the second phrase, he leaned into a subtle dynamic change, a softening that felt almost hesitant, as if the music itself were questioning something. Dr. Webb's eyes widened. That hesitation wasn't in the score. It was in the story. David wasn't playing the notes as instructions. He was playing them as confession. Margaret Rothschild pressed her lips together. She didn't know why, but something in her chest ached. The sound reminded her of a moment she hadn't thought about in years, standing alone in a hospital hallway, waiting for news she didn't want. Vincent shifted his weight. This wasn't right. The boy was taking liberties. And yet, it worked. The room leaned in. David's left hand grounded the piece, steady and unwavering, while his right hand explored the melody with restraint. He didn't decorate it. He didn't dramatize it. He trusted it. With each phrase, the music seemed to shed something: polish, ego, performance, until what remained felt raw and unprotected. Vincent swallowed. He knew this piece. He had played it hundreds of times, but he had never heard it like this. David reached a transition point, a moment most pianists use to display technical mastery. He didn't. He softened instead. The notes thinned, almost fragile. The effect was devastating. A woman in the front row wiped her eyes without realizing she was crying. Miss Carter stared at David, breath caught in her chest. She had heard him practice in empty classrooms and echoing basements. But this was different. David wasn't just playing for himself anymore. He was translating something the room didn't know how to say. Vincent felt a chill crawl up his arms. For the first time that night, he wasn't thinking about reputation. He wasn't thinking about control. He was thinking about exposure. Because in every pause David allowed, in every restrained phrase, something unspoken was being revealed. Not about the boy, about him. About how Vincent had learned the perfect sound while avoiding vulnerability. About how applause had taught him to protect himself from feeling too much. David played on. The notes began to gather momentum now, not speeding recklessly, but building with inevitability. The music felt like a story unfolding rather than a performance progressing. And then something extraordinary happened. The audience forgot to evaluate. They stopped comparing, stopped judging, stopped deciding whether this belonged. They simply listened. Vincent realized he hadn't breathed in several seconds. David's hands moved with certainty now, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable. He wasn't performing to the room. He was playing through it. And with every measure, the space between performer and audience dissolved. This was no longer a blind boy at a piano. This was a voice, a truth, a reckoning. As David approached the end of the opening section, he slowed, not to dramatize, but to honor something. The final note of the phrase lingered just long enough to ache. Then he lifted his hands. The silence that followed was electric. No one moved. No one clapped. Because everyone understood instinctively that whatever came next would change the night forever. And Vincent Sterling knew it too, because in those first notes, the boy he had tried to humiliate had already done something irreversible. He had been heard. David didn't rush back into the music. He let the silence stretch, just long enough to feel uncomfortable, not awkward, revealing. Because silence, when it follows truth, forces people to confront what they're feeling without distraction. Vincent Sterling shifted behind him, the sound of his polished shoes against the stage suddenly too loud. He became aware of his own presence in a way he hadn't been all evening, not as a center, but as something exposed. David lowered his hands again, and this time, the music didn't begin softly. It arrived. The next passage surged forward with quiet force, like a memory you don't want but can't stop replaying. The tempo tightened, not with aggression, but with urgency. Each note carried weight, not because it was struck harder, but because it meant more. Dr. Harrison Webb felt his chest constrict. This wasn't interpretation anymore. This was testimony. David's fingers moved faster now, but never recklessly. Difficult passages unfolded, as if difficulty didn't exist. The technical challenges, the ones conservatory students spent years mastering, flowed from him without tension. Vincent recognized it immediately. This wasn't practice. This was mastery born from necessity. The audience leaned forward as one organism. People who had come to be seen now forgot they were visible. Their attention narrowed, tunneled, locked onto the sound pouring from the piano. David reached the section most pianists feared. The passage where precision alone wasn't enough, where restraint mattered more than brilliance. Vincent had always attacked this part, asserting control, proving dominance over the instrument. David did the opposite. He let it break, not sloppily, humanly. The melody bent inward, collapsing slightly under its own weight, as if grief itself were momentarily too heavy to carry. The left hand grounded the chaos, steady and unyielding, while the right hand faltered, just enough to feel real. Someone in the audience gasped quietly. Margaret Rothschild felt tears spill down her cheeks, uninvited and unstoppable. She didn't understand why this This boy had dismantled her so completely, she only knew it had reached something she had hidden even from herself. Vincent's heart pounded. This wasn't how Bach was supposed to sound. And yet, this was the first time it ever had. David pressed forward, the music now building towards something unavoidable. The phrases grew bolder, then quieter, then bold again, like waves pulling back before crashing harder. Every note felt intentional. Every pause felt earned. David wasn't performing for applause. He was reliving something. The audience began to sense it. This wasn't a display of talent. It was a story being told in a language older than words. In the fifth row, Aunt Deborah, who had slipped in quietly earlier and taken a seat near the aisle, covered her mouth. She had watched David suffer in silence for years. She had watched him turn pain into discipline, loneliness into focus. But she had never seen him release it like this. David reached the climax of the piece. The notes surged upward, demanding strength, clarity, courage. Vincent felt his knees weaken, because David wasn't just surpassing him. He was exposing him. Every choice Vincent had made over decades, every emotionally safe interpretation, every polished performance that avoided vulnerability, was being undone in real time, not through criticism, through contrast. David's playing made something painfully clear. You could spend a lifetime perfecting sound and still never touch truth. The room felt suspended, breath held collectively, as David pushed to the final movement. The music transformed now, no longer burdened, no longer restrained. It rose. The sorrow didn't disappear. It evolved. The notes carried acceptance, not peaceful, not gentle, but earned, the kind that comes only after loss has been fully known. Dr. Webb felt tears blur his vision. In 40 years, he had never heard this piece played like this, not by anyone. David's hands flew across the keys now, not to impress, but to resolve. The instrument responded as if it recognized him, as if the piano itself understood why it was being played this way. Vincent's mind raced. This wasn't possible. This boy, this blind kid he had mocked, was doing something that couldn't be taught, something that couldn't be purchased, something that came only from having lost everything and refusing to go numb. David approached the final measures. The room was so silent it felt fragile. The last notes descended gently, like a truth settling into place. Then, stillness. David's hands remained on the keys for a heartbeat longer than necessary, sealing the moment. When he finally lifted them, the sound faded completely. No applause, no movement, just stunned quiet. Then someone stood, then another. Then the entire room rose as if pulled upward by something greater than etiquette. The applause exploded, not polite, not controlled, but raw, emotional, relentless. People cried openly, not for the boy, for themselves. Vincent Sterling stood frozen. His world had collapsed in less than 10 minutes. Not because he had played poorly, but because he had been revealed. David stood slowly and turned toward the audience. There was no triumph on his face, only calm, only dignity. He had said everything he needed to say, and the room, finally, had listened. The applause didn't fade quickly. It lingered, as if the room itself needed time to recover from what had just been exposed. People clapped until their hands hurt, until standing became instinct rather than courtesy. Some looked at David with awe. Others looked away, embarrassed by how confidently they had judged him earlier. Vincent Sterling remained motionless near the piano. He did not clap. He couldn't. Every sound around him felt distant, distorted, like he was underwater. His ears rang, not from volume, but from recognition. Dr. Harrison Webb was the first to step forward. He didn't address David immediately. He turned to Vincent. "I've conducted this piece for 4 decades," Webb said quietly, his voice carrying more weight than volume ever could. "I have never heard it played like that." The implication hung in the air. Vincent opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Margaret Rothschild approached next. Her expression had changed completely. No trace of dismissal, no trace of superiority, only something close to reverence. "What is your name?" she asked David. "David Thompson," he replied. She nodded slowly, as if committing it to memory. "You shouldn't be here as a guest," she said. "You should be here as a future." A murmur rippled through the room. Ms. Carter felt her knees weaken. She pressed a hand to her chest, overwhelmed, not by victory, but by relief, the kind that comes when truth finally outruns prejudice. Vincent took a step forward. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, forcing composure into his voice, "let's not get carried away. Talent is important, yes, but discipline, training, context." "Humility," Dr. Webb interrupted calmly. The word landed like a verdict. The room went still again. "Humility," Webb repeated, turning fully toward Vincent now, "is what allows talent to grow rather than calcify." Vincent flushed. "This was an emotional performance," he said tightly. "Impressive, yes, but emotion fades. Structure lasts." David turned his head slightly toward him. "My parents didn't," he said. The words were not sharp. They didn't need to be. Vincent staggered backward as if struck. No one laughed. No one defended him. The silence that followed was merciless. Patricia Wells, the foundation director, cleared her throat nervously. She had allowed this moment to happen, had even encouraged it, believing the star would shine brighter against a powerless contrast. She was wrong. This event, she said carefully, was meant to celebrate excellence. David nodded. "It did," he said. Several guests exchanged looks. Phones came out, quietly, discreetly, but they were recording now, not the performance, but the aftermath, because moments like this didn't stay contained. They escaped. Vincent felt it, the shift in gravity. The room no longer leaned toward him. It leaned away. Dr. Webb turned to David again. "Where do you study?" he asked. "I don't," David replied. "Not formally." Webb inhaled slowly. "That," he said, "is unacceptable." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a card. "You will be auditioning at Juilliard," he continued. "Not as charity, not as inspiration, as competition." Gasps rippled. Vincent's heart dropped. Juilliard, that was where careers were decided. Margaret Rothschild stepped forward again. "I will sponsor whatever he needs," she said without hesitation. "Instruments, tutors, travel." She looked directly at Vincent. "This," she added, "is what investment should look like." Vincent tried to smile. It didn't work. The applause resumed, not for performance now, but for recognition, for accountability, for the correction of something long ignored. David stood quietly in the center of it all. He did not bow. He did not smile, because this moment wasn't about reward. It was about balance. As guests began to surround David, asking questions, offering praise, scrambling to align themselves with the right side of history, Vincent stood alone, invisible, for the first time in his career. Ms. Carter approached David, tears streaming freely now. "You did it," she whispered. David shook his head gently. "No," he said. They finally listened. Across the room, Vincent watched his world recede. Contracts would be questioned, invitations reconsidered. Whispers would follow him out the door and multiply in the days ahead. He had come here expecting applause. He was leaving with exposure. And as David was escorted toward the exit by people who suddenly couldn't do enough for him, Vincent realized something devastating. He had mistaken status for superiority. And talent, real talent, had corrected him. Publicly, irreversibly by morning. The story had escaped the walls of the Lincoln Art Center. It moved faster than anyone expected. A short clip, recorded shakily from the fourth row, appeared online before sunrise. It wasn't the full performance. It didn't need to be. 30 seconds of music, followed by the stunned silence, then the eruption of applause. That was enough. By noon, it had 1 million views. By nightfall, David Thompson's name was everywhere, not because he was blind, not because he was young, but because people felt something real, and they weren't used to that. Music critics who had ignored community concerts for decades suddenly had opinions. Social media feeds filled with the same sentence repeated in different forms. "I've never heard Bach play like that." Interviews followed. Requests came from places David had only ever heard about on the radio. But through it all, David stayed exactly where he was, back in his aunt's apartment, practicing on the same worn keyboard, the same cracked bench beneath him. The world had discovered him. He hadn't changed. Juilliard's audition panel didn't clap when David finished. They didn't need to. Silence again did the talking. 2 weeks later, David received a full scholarship. Tuition, housing, support services, everything. The letter arrived in Braille and print. As if the institution itself were acknowledging that this time, access would not be an afterthought. Dr. Harrison Webb personally oversaw his placement. "This isn't about potential," he told the board. "It's about responsibility. We don't ignore voices like this." David walked through Juilliard's halls quietly, cane tapping against polished floors that once felt unreachable. Students stopped mid-conversation when he passed. Not out of pity, out of respect. Margaret Rothschild funded a foundation within months, dedicated to finding extraordinary talent in places the elite rarely looked. She spoke publicly about the night she had been corrected by humility. "Privilege without purpose," she said, "was waste." Vincent Sterling watched all of this unfold from a very different place. His contracts dissolved one by one. Invitations stopped arriving. Critics who once praised his precision now questioned his depth. One review cut especially deep. "Sterling plays flawlessly." But after hearing David Thompson, one wonders what he's been protecting himself from. Vincent moved out of his Manhattan penthouse quietly. David debuted at Carnegie Hall before his 18th birthday. The ovation lasted 14 minutes. He dedicated a performance to anyone who was told to wait their turn when their voice was ready now. And somewhere, watching from a small apartment, Vincent Sterling finally understood what he had lost. Not status, purpose. Years later, people would still talk about that night, not because of the music alone, but because of what it revealed. David Thompson never described himself as a symbol. He resisted every attempt to turn his story into a slogan or a lesson wrapped in neat language. Whenever reporters asked how it felt to overcome blindness, poverty, or prejudice, he redirected the question gently. "I didn't overcome anything," he said. "I listened." And that was the truth. David didn't rise because someone gave him permission. He rose because when the moment came, he spoke in the only language that had ever kept him alive. Music wasn't his escape from pain. It was the place where pain could finally tell the truth. At Juilliard, professors stopped trying to mold him. They learned from him instead. Students packed into practice rooms just to hear him work through a phrase, not a copy technique, but to understand intention. David taught without teaching, because authenticity is gravity. He used his success carefully, quietly. Scholarships were funded. Community programs expanded. Old church basements gained new instruments. Children who had been told they were too much or not enough were given space to discover who they already were. When asked why he never responded publicly to Vincent Sterling's downfall, David simply said, "Music isn't revenge, it's revelation." Vincent, for his part, lived a smaller life after that night. Not poorer, just quieter. He taught, he practiced, and for the first time in decades, he listened to music without applause waiting at the end. Some lessons arrived too late to save careers, but never too late to save character. On the anniversary of his Carnegie Hall debut, David returned to the Lincoln Art Center, not as a guest, not as a charity highlight, as the headliner. Before he played, he addressed the audience briefly. "This piano has heard many voices," he said, "some loud, some careful, some afraid." He paused. "Tonight, let it hear yours." When David played, the room listened. Not because he demanded it, but because they had learned what happens when you don't. And somewhere in the audience sat a young kid holding a white cane, waiting. The story didn't end with applause. It continued, in every space that finally made room. Sometimes the world doesn't doubt you because you lack talent. It doubts you because your truth threatens comfort. So if you've ever been underestimated, don't get louder, get honest,